After Nintendo announced it was porting Ys 8 to the Switch, I decided to play through some of the older titles on Steam. During my playthrough of Ys, the Oath in Felghana, I got to this giant flying fire snake boss, and, without knowing any of its attack patterns, died fairly quickly. Then the game did something I really appreciated. It gave me this. Now, why do I appreciate the option to immediately retry a boss? It's because before this boss and after the last save point is a trek through a long lava-filled pathway, then a cutscene, then an escape sequence, all ending right at this boss. The retry option cuts out all the tedium of having to redo all that pointless stuff over again, and why should I have to? I already know where to go, and sitting through two unskippable segments that I've already seen aren't beneficial to me in any way. So all it would be is tedium, and it's a problem a number of games seem to have. Now, what is tedium? The dictionary definition would be something that's dull, slow, or monotonous. Basically, anything that's boring. Just keep in mind that what's boring is rather subjective because different players can have different opinions on what they find fun. That said, I still think there are elements in games that are more likely to create tedium. One major aspect of gaming tedium is excessive downtime. Downtime is part of a game where little to nothing of interest is occurring in terms of gameplay. One of the major contenders for this is travel. Games that aren't isolated into one small area will likely have you moving your character from one point of interest to another, with lack of any significant gameplay in between. Keeping these sections as short as possible helps keep the tedium down. If you can't do it by distance, consider ways to change the speed at which you move or provide fast travel locations. If you can't do either of those, then make travel more interesting, like the detours in Skyrim where new locations pop up everywhere, giving you something new to explore. Or how The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker has rupe barrels you can chase down while sailing across the ocean. You could also use this time to show off a good soundtrack or provide meaningful dialogue between characters. Just make sure you really add something more entertaining to the travel, or you end up with the tailing missions from Assassin's Creed, where you're moving from A to B, but now have to watch someone else while moving slower than normal. Perhaps one of the more interesting ways to avoid travel tedium can be found in Battle Royale games, like Fortnite, where most of the game involves traveling from point to point, but never really feels boring due to the game's use of tension. The free-for-all aspect of these games means that you can be attacked anywhere at any time, so you must constantly be aware and ready to respond if you're engaged. This same use of tension can be found in other games where it's used to instead fight off the tedium of waiting. Waiting is pretty self-explanatory. It's where you're waiting for the game to do a certain thing or act a certain way so that you can respond to that action. Like waiting for an enemy to do a certain attack so you can parry, or waiting for a platform to move in a spot where you can jump on it. Stealth games can have it much worse when you need to stay still and out of sight, but this is why I say tension is so useful, because all that sitting still doesn't feel so tedious when you're waiting for the perfect moment to break cover and strike.
This guy really does move like a cat.
When you can't use tension, there really isn't much you can do with this kind of downtime. For really long wait times, like waiting for a certain time of day, you should make sure you can speed up or skip the larger portion of it, similar to the way fast travel works with covering distance. You could also provide distractions, like small quests or battles to take up that time. For the small wait times that you can't really fill with meaningful gameplay, you might consider using that time to connect the player with their character through the use of idle animations. Basic ones might be a character scratching their face or adjusting their guns, but you could go further, like in Mario Odyssey, where Mario will exercise or fall asleep when left alone for too long. He even has different animations depending on the temperature. And these idle animations are great because sometimes the most engaging thing to do while waiting is watching your character be as bored as you are. Sometimes.
I'm out of here.
You should also be careful with cutscenes. Even if your story is interesting or your cutscenes action-packed, you don't want them to last too long because sitting through a 10-minute cutscene can become just as tedious as the other forms of downtime. Games are an interactive media after all. They're meant to be played, not just watched. If possible, you might try to work the story elements into or parallel to the gameplay to lessen your need for cutscenes. For instance, the story in Ico is told through the mechanics of the game, as Ico and Yorda work as a bonded pair with each having a unique role to play. Or the follow segments in Assassin's Creed, which might not seem that interesting, but would you rather have a cutscene of walking and talking instead? And when you do use cutscenes, there should always be the option to skip them, even if it's an important one, because not every player is going to be interested, and maybe some have already seen it once before. For these players especially, the cutscenes are extremely tedious as they're forced to sit through them. However, all these different forms of downtime need to be taken with a grain of salt, because you shouldn't confuse tedious downtime with intentional periods of calm, which are small parts of low-energy gameplay, usually following some sort of high-intensity gameplay. And without it, you might find yourself in a constant loop of action sequences, which would end up being more exhausting than tedious. The Ys example I stated at the beginning would fall under the tedious act of repetition, which is running into the same elements over and over in a game. When it's just a hunk of content you keep running into, you can remove that tedium by finding ways to bypass it, but most of the repetition comes not from replaying the same segments, but rather from the gameplay mechanics. This is one of the harder forms of tedium to completely remove because games are often designed around a central type of gameplay, so you have to find different ways to keep the mechanics interesting. The Dark Souls series is a great example of the many ways you can help alleviate the tediousness of repetition. Since combat is the major type of gameplay and there are only 4 real actions you can do in battle, which are attacking, dodging, blocking, and parrying, From Software manages that repetition by adding variation. Variation helps alleviate tedium by letting you use your central game mechanic in a variety of different scenarios. In the Dark Souls games, you can attack not only with swords, but spears, axes, whips, scythes, bows, magic spells, and even shields. These change the way you attack, affecting your attack speed, range, damage. Spells can have a variety of different effects, and shields can have different blocking strengths and parry windows. If you don't much care for the different variety of items and instead choose to use the same weapon setup throughout the whole game, worry not, because there are also different variations of enemies. With their different movesets and body types, you need to change the method of engagement for the task at hand. And From Software can do more than change the enemy type, they can have enemies intermingle, making you fight different battles using both old and new enemies at the same time. Another way to keep your central mechanics from feeling repetitive is to add depth. Depth is how you can add more to these mechanics by using them in a more skillful and deliberate way. And while Dark Souls may not be the series with the most depth in its systems, it's still there to be found. The backstab is a great first example of depth because it's just an attack, but it requires you to think about the best way to position yourself behind an enemy to pull it off. But there's also how parries work better when done against certain attacks, or that bigger weapons are more likely to stagger enemies, or you can combine your attacks with different movement types to pull off jump, roll, and sprint attacks. All of this can be taken to the extreme when fighting against the game's trademark bosses. Which brings me to the one part of Dark Souls' repetition that's not alleviated at all, and that's because it's intentional. The bosses in the Souls series are difficult, and From Software expects you to fight these bosses over and over again because they're so difficult. And in doing so, they expect you to learn how these bosses fight and get better with each attempt. Repetition is used as a learning tool. Learning in this manner is hardly unheard of, in fact it's a rather common practice. To keep it from getting tedious though, you need to have a good grasp of the time it takes to learn a certain thing, which isn't always easy, and that might be one of the reasons that the Souls series has always allowed you to summon other people to help you during fights, so as to take some of the pressure off. One other type of repetitive tedium that isn't really prevalent in Dark Souls is grinding, which is when the player has to repeat something over and over again for some type of reward, often a level or item of some kind. As for leveling, it might crop up if you fail to pick up your souls after your death a good number of times, or when a boss seems so overwhelming that you need to buff yourself up. Having good game balance removes the need for doing this type of grinding, and From Software is fairly good at balancing their games so that your skill matters more than your level. As for the item grinding, there really isn't anything you can do. Dark Souls' currency is the same as its level experience, so grinding may be necessary if you're not willing to give up a few levels to buy something. And if it's an enemy drop you're after, then you don't really have any other options. Bad luck means you'll have to keep fighting the same enemy over and over, even if you use items to increase your drop chance. This is true in most other games as well. The best way to stop this type of grinding would be to include a secondary method of acquiring these items, like how Monster Hunter World allows you to purchase rare monster drops as a reward for completing weekly challenges. You also need to be wary of a game's length and scale, which when unmanaged can lead to tedious gameplay. You always want to try and keep your game at an acceptable length, not too short and definitely not too long. But that's not where the real trouble is. The real trouble shows up when you get design meant to artificially lengthen a game. Nothing's more tedious than being given a bunch of superfluous side quests or having constant use of backtracking just to make the game have a longer runtime. And sometimes the length extension doesn't come from large things, but rather an overuse of smaller things, such as slow climbing speed or simple tasks having some sort of extended animation. A single extra second to pick up an item can really add up when doing it 1,000 different times in one playthrough. And scale can also have a lot to do with this. Scale is the size of your game. That can mean the size of the map, how many different mechanics you have, or how many tasks there are to complete. The size of the map can easily affect the length of a game, open worlds having the worst of it. I already mentioned how the size creates extra travel downtime, but being so big can also mean it's bland and lifeless, giving the game a boring feel which is no fun to play in. So you should try and keep the size down to something that truly matters for the main content. And having too many mechanics can lead to a game that's much too complex to fully grasp. With so many different things being managed at once, it can become too much for the player to deal with and they may stop playing, or at least play in a way that doesn't fit with the intended vision. And just because you add more mechanics doesn't mean your game gets more interesting. That's what the concept of depth I mentioned was for. And when your game is oversaturated with tasks to complete, the players may feel completely overwhelmed with how much there is to do. This can be a big problem in collectathons or even survival games, where the need to collect every little thing can feel like work rather than gameplay. Some sim games like Stardew Valley and Slime Rancher make it so when you have too many tasks to take care of, you're given ways to either make those tasks easier or automate them completely. You might also try and make it so tasks are only as necessary as the player wants them to be. Like how Mario Odyssey is filled with hundreds of moons to collect, but they aren't all needed to complete the game, so anything beyond what's necessary can be done at your own time and at your own pace. Another way to keep the tediousness down would be making your game as efficient as possible. This is done by making sure that the designs of a game run smoothly and as intended, while also weeding out wasteful inefficiencies. Most namely would be bugs and glitches. These things can really ruin a game for people. Some can be harmless enough, but others that affect core gameplay or even crash the game should be hunted down and fixed. You should also make sure your game doesn't feel clunky, like having a delay after buttons are pressed, getting weird or obscured camera views, or having moments of game lag, especially in multiplayer games. And if your game has a lot of menus or an inventory system, you should keep it manageable by adding sorting functions or having tabs for different subjects. And work on improving smaller things over time. Take, for instance, the changes that looting took in Bethesda's RPGs over the years. In Morrowind and Oblivion, you would need to check every little thing to see what's inside. In Fallout 3 and Skyrim, they add the words empty so that you can avoid pointlessly checking things with no loot. And by Fallout 4, you can see all the loot in a container just by looking at it. And you don't even need to open another window, you can loot it all right there. These sorts of small improvements really help the game get a much better flow and lessen the time you need to spend in menus. Loading is another part of games that, while necessary, should be kept as short as possible by making the game as optimized as it can be. That said, it's not always realistic given the increasing resource needs of modern games, so if you do end up having loading screens, try and make them as entertaining as possible. The most common attempt at this is giving the player something to read. Sometimes it's tips, other times it's lore, just something to occupy the time before you get to the good part. However, this only works as long as you can keep providing new information. Rereading a tip isn't helping anyone. Other games might give you control over your character during loading screens so that you can freely mess around. The Bayonetta series even goes so far as to give you full access to all your moves so that the loading screen acts as a pseudo-training ground. You can even turn your loading screen into a minigame like the Namco arcade title Ridge Racer, which has a round of Galaxian in its loading screen, which is not only a great idea, but it also rewards you with extra cars if you beat the wave of enemies during that round, giving it a useful second function. Other developers, instead of making loading screens interesting, hide them behind other parts of their games, such as Monster Hunter World using a preparatory period where you gear up for a fight while it loads the bulk of a level, or Uncharted's interactive area transitions that are usually accompanied by meaningful dialogue, or just simply hiding the loading screen behind a cutscene. But make sure when you do any of these that you're making something that's marginally more interesting than a loading screen. Of course, the absolute best way to remove the tedium of a loading screen is still to just optimize your game so much that no one even knows the game just loaded something. It's like I said at the beginning though, tedium is subjective. Most of Breath of the Wild is travel time, MMOs are often filled with grinding, and a good cinematic cutscene can keep people interested for any length of time. And while many people enjoy these things, some won't, and that's why tedium will always be a constant in games. Because for every person who finds a piece of gameplay enjoyable, another will find it slow, repetitive, or just a complete waste of time. But that doesn't mean you should stop trying to make a game as fun as it can be, because finding ways to make tedious things interesting is one of the whole points of game design. Hey, Val here. One thing I didn't mention was when developers use tedium intentionally. This can be seen in a lot of different mobile games or games with microtransactions as a money-making tool, where the player has some sort of forced waiting period or the need to grind for some resource, but could also just pay money to bypass those things. There isn't really a solution to this kind of tedium because it was intentional, but I felt it was worth mentioning in hopes that people just stop doing it.